Okay, welcome back, class. Got your first exam under your belt. Now we are going to really split off where macroeconomics splits off from microeconomics. We're going into the big topics for macroeconomics, and our course actually gets it starts picking up tempo quite a bit from here on out. I will try to include a few more clips and something interesting in the course for you, but basically the syllabus is still the same, and just follow that and everybody should be fine. Everyone is doing pretty darn well so far. As I said, we are now entering the area of this course where macro really splits from micro. We are going to be talking about the three biggest characteristics or concepts of macroeconomics, which is gross domestic product, and then the two evils of macroeconomics, which are unemployment and inflation, typically the price vary, the overall change in the price level, whether it's high going up or going down, deflation. All right, so first one on the list is our gross domestic product. From your reading, okay, what does it do for us? Why do we use it? It's probably the best tool that we have, just quite frankly, to measure our standard of living. How are we doing? Is it perfect? No, it's not. It's not perfect, but it does give us a pretty good idea of the standard of living of a country. In other words, if we have a country that has a gross domestic product that is growing at a fairly strong clip, meaning that economy is putting out typically more final goods and services, the chances are that the standard of living of the population is improving, okay? And when you talk about standard of living, that includes so many ideas, infant mortality, access to education, access to health care, and life expectancy, which at your age you're probably not too concerned about the life expectancy factor, but as you become more mature, that life expectancy figure becomes more and more important. So those are the things we're looking at. Now, again, it's not perfect, but it will give us an idea of our basic standard of living. And again, remember though, in economics, it's a circular flow. Nothing is done in isolation in economics, especially when we talk about macroeconomics. For instance, we talk about my spending is your income. And interestingly enough, that's a way that we're going to define gross domestic product. It can be defined in a number of ways, and we're going to take a look at all three of them today. Okay? All right, well, what else does this gross domestic product do for us? Well, it tells us, for the most part, where we are in the business cycle. Now, this that I draw is a typical business cycle. Historically, the business cycle used to run between 6 and 8 years. That was the length of a business cycle. Business cycle is composed of 4 parts. Basically, we have an expansion or recovery, if you will, and that's when the economy is getting larger and stronger and better, all right? And then you keep heading up until you hit the peak. And business activity has just, reached the top, and perhaps time for a breather, whatever. Then from the peak, we start heading down, and what they call a recession or a contraction. All right, that's the third part of the business cycle. Then we go to a trough, or the very bottom of that recession. Again, you go from peak to peak or trough to trough all four stages is one business cycle. And again, it typically went from 6 to 8 years. Now, some of the newer books and studies say, well, you know, it's starting to stretch out a bit more than 6 to 8 years, which can very well be true. But you have to remember what they're looking at and including is the recovery that we had coming out of the Great Recession. Now, that recovery was one of the longest, slowest, most painful recoveries in modern U.S. economic history. And what happened was that was due to the turmoil in the financial system. The government came in, pumped a lot of money into the banking system with the expectation that the banks were going to loan that money out. Well, if any of you or if any of your parents tried to get loans, you know, anywhere in 2012 or so, 2013, you know, you can ask them. It was not easy to get loans in those years, the years following supposedly the recovery years of the Great Recession. As a matter of fact, the Great Recession lasted, if you lived through it, it lasted a lot longer than most economic books will give it credit for. But the long and the short of it was the banks did not loan out the funds that they got. They kept them. And they did give each other, and I knew, I went to school with some individuals whose parents were involved in the large New York banks, and many of them got some very, very, very large bonuses. So they did bonus the money out, but in terms of loaning it to you and I, not so much. So what happened was we had a very long recovery, which tended to make the business cycle look a lot longer than the typical 6 to 8 weeks. Okay? Well, anyway, getting back to it, the GDP will tell us, you know, where are we in this business cycle? In other words, if we're growing, if the GDP numbers are strong and they're up 3.5% or so, typically we are probably in an expansion or a recovery portion of the business cycle. If we've just hit the top, probably we are at the peak. And if GDP is starting to slow down, we are more than likely in a contraction or a recession. Okay, so gives us our basic standard of living, where we are in the business cycle, and also it helps to explain economic growth. And again, rule of thumb, if your GDP is strong and growing, your economic growth is going to go hand in hand with strong gross domestic product growth. Is it perfect? No, it's not always perfect, but it's probably the best tool that we have. We have to also remember, when we talk about gross domestic product, when we give a number for it, it is the nominal, meaning in current dollars. To get what we call real gross domestic product, we have to take the inflation factor out of the nominal, and once we do that, then we have what is called real gross domestic product. That's what we use when we're going to compare, this year to, let's say, the year 2010, all right? Because even though there wasn't a huge amount of inflation between 2010 to now, albeit we are experiencing some inflation. This is probably one of the first times in a long time I'm saying that yes, we are looking at an inflation factor somewhere in the neighborhood of 7%, which is quite a bit considering. But then again, you have to also remember the government is trying to take care of this economy through this COVID pandemic. And it doesn't really matter, Republican, Democrat, it doesn't matter the administration. the fact remains that the government had to spend quite a bit of money, on the economy to keep the economy going. So these things can happen that we will start, picking up some points of inflation, and it gets to be really simple. I mean, if you're spending at this level, or if you've introduced a certain amount of money into the economy and you're up at this level, but your economy is still producing at that level, it doesn't take an economic genius to figure out, hey, we're going to have some inflation, all right? So we are experiencing a little inflation, not to be unexpected, okay? So if you see, we've had higher than normal inflation rates, we can attribute that mostly to the COVID pandemic. And we'll get through this, and we'll start, working down those inflation numbers, I believe. But we have a little ways to go yet, unfortunately, but it will happen, all right? So, number one, gives a standard of living, reflects the standard of living, I should say, of the population. And I skipped to 3, tells us where we are in the business cycle. And one thing I want to bring out is, and we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about the 3 evils of, or the 2 evils of economics, in terms of job growth or job contraction. Typically, in a recovery, we will have not only business expanding, but we will have job growth. But what we have to remember is that's not always the case. We can have what they call a jobless recovery. So in other words, we could be here going on the upswing, the recovery, the expansion, and yes, businesses will be recovering, will be expanding. But just bear in mind that we could have what is called, and we have had, what is called a jobless recovery, where business has expanded, but it didn't really need that many more folks to come along with it, all right? However, in a recession or a contraction, these are always marked by not only a business slowdown, but also increased unemployment, all right? And with that being said, we will touch on the other 2 major topics of macroeconomics. We have national employment and the overall price level. So these are the big 3: national output, national employment, and overall price level, okay? And again, this is kind of a common sense in a way. Nations that produce a lot of valuable stuff, generally, you're going to say that, yeah, they have a healthier economy, okay? Nothing too surprising there. But as we look at this business cycle, what we want to remember is the 3 major goals of macroeconomics is to get this to look more like this, where we don't have the big highs and the big lows. We have what is called smooth, continuous growth with low unemployment, not zero unemployment. We'll talk about that in a minute, but low unemployment and stable pricing, meaning we're not experiencing inflation, which is a general rise in the price level, or deflation, which can also hurt an economy, which is the general lowering of the price level. Okay, so this is the basis for our jumping off point for the lesson today, and we'll get into gross domestic product first, and then we will get into unemployment. If we have time, we'll also get into the price level. Might have to put that on a separate day, but we will get to it eventually. All right? So let's see what we've got here. All right, let's see. I hope you can see that all right. Okay, so for gross domestic product, we can arrive at gross domestic product by taking three different paths. One is the output path, or the output method for calculating gross domestic product. The second one is the expenditure, total expenditure path, all right? And the third one is total factor income. That means you and I. Total factor income, all right? You can use any one of those three to arrive at gross domestic product. And this ties in with, your spending is my income, I turn around, and then I have income and I turn around and I spend it, all right? So that's why we have these three, all right? Now, again, the key term to remember for gross domestic product is real gross domestic product. That means we have squeezed the inflation factor out of the nominal gross domestic product term, okay? And why is that important? Well, like I said, it's important to use real gross domestic product so that our numbers aren't skewed by the inflation factor, albeit we haven't had that much inflation in recent years, but still, we want to get an accurate figure. There's a great clip in econ movies, the same folks that I believe were making our Crash Course economic videos. I'll try to get a few of those up for you. And they're comparing the years, they take the movie Back to the Future, and they're comparing the economy in the 50s to the economy in the 1980s. And they had to take the inflation factor out, because if they left the inflation in, it looked like our GDP, it did grow, but it looks like it grew by leaps and bounds. So important to remember, take the inflation factor out of the nominal and we get real GDP, all right? That's the one we use when we're comparing years to years for our economy. Now, when we want to compare one country to another country, we also have to take, one more step. We want to squeeze the inflation factor out of it to get real GDP, but we also have to take in consideration how many people they have in these countries, all right? Example, India. India had a real GDP of about $3 trillion, all right? And if we look at Norway had a GDP of about $1/3 trillion. Now, is India just doing that much better in general? Well, typical economic answer, yes and no. They're doing more in terms of gross domestic product, but we have to remember that there's over 1.3 billion people in India, all right? As opposed to Norway, they've got 5 million people. So that's quite a difference. So when we're comparing, and this is the key term we use when we're comparing one country to another, we'll take the real GDP per person, or real GDP per capita. We divide it by the population. Then we get a real true number of where the heck we are, in terms of growth. And in our country, when we do it, I believe it comes out to around $63,400 per person, which, that's a pretty substantial figure when you think about it. That means we put out $63,400 worth of new final goods and services for every single one of us in the country. That's a pretty amazing figure, if you ask me. Okay, so anyway, moving on and talking about, the makeup of GDP. Well, again, a lot of this you probably have already read about. If we look at what the economy was 2 centuries ago, the majority of stuff or the economic activity centered around farming, around agriculture. And that's exactly what it was. We went from a farming type economy to a century ago, we went to more of an industrial economy, okay? And thank God we did, because as we were talking about, and we will be talking about economic growth, the Industrial Revolution just made our economic growth skyrocket. So the Industrial Revolution was very important. So we went 2 centuries ago, it was agriculture. 1 century ago, it was primarily manufacturing. Today, we are pretty much, not all, but the majority is in service, all right? Services, all sorts of, and there are all sorts of services, from, accounting services to a doctor's visit, to a haircut, to a shoe shine. All these are services, all right? So this is the kind of economy we are looking at today, all right? So the first definition or method of calculating gross domestic product is the output method, all right? And it's probably the one that comes to mind for most of us when we first start talking about what does our economy produce per year. That's probably the one that comes to mind, output. And when we look at the total output method, we say, okay, it is the total, and each word in this definition is important. It is the total market value of all final goods and services, not intermediate, and we'll get into that in a minute, that are domestically produced in a specific time period, typically 1 year. Okay? So, you say, well, all right, there's a car dealer down the road from where you live. They don't deal in new cars. They deal in, typically cars that are maybe 2 or 3 years old. And it's a pretty, good business. They do a lot of business. But all the business that they do we count it as gross domestic product for this year? Well, no, we don't. Because if we took cars that were 3 years old, and that's not really a used car by today's standards, but anyway, if we took the sale of cars that are 3 years old, we would be blowing up our gross domestic product figures by quite a bit, because it would be unfair to count that car again. And you have to remember, if it's 3 years old and you bought it, and let's say you kept it for 7 years and it's 10 years old, the way they're making cars today, a 10-year-old car is still very serviceable. So that could be sold again 7 or 8 years from now. So in order to avoid this double or triple counting, they say it's got to be a new product. In other words, new cars and trucks that are being produced, okay? So we concentrate on what is new, all right? And I know sometimes it's hard to imagine saying, well, wait a minute, that's business, but it's not new products being introduced in our economy, okay? Do stocks and bonds count? Typically, financial instruments such as stocks and bonds, they don't count that because they look at that as not really something new being produced. They look at that as more of a transfer of wealth from one sector of the economy to another. For instance, if you buy 1,000 shares of GM, nothing really has been created. It's just that, GM had 1,000 shares that now you own. So it's it's a transfer of ownership of wealth, but it's not really producing anything brand new. So we steer clear pretty much of financial instruments. Then also we look at goods such as United States Steel. You think of what? U.S. Steel, big company, or Alcoa Aluminum, big operation, big company. And if you went to their president and said, hey, what you did last year it's not going to be, we're not going to use your sales figure for last year. And, you know, I remember when we had our manufacturing companies, and all the component parts we made for the automotive and for the national defense, I can remember thinking, well, gee, our sales, you know, we're not going to use our sales. And the reason why they say that is because if they took the sale from my company or U.S. Steel or Alcoa and then counted the sales from other companies that the goods went into, they'll be double and triple counting the same items. Example, we made a lot of aluminum transmission parts that went into Ford transmissions, okay? We bought our aluminum from Alcoa. Now, if Alcoa, although they did have their own mining, but if they did buy the raw material to make aluminum, the bauxite, and they brought it into their operation, and then they brought in other inputs, and they made aluminum out of it, okay? And then they sold the aluminum bars to our company. Then we took those aluminum bars and fed them into our machining centers, and then we made these small valves that go into your Ford car or truck. Then we turn around and sold it to Ford or a subsidiary to Ford, and then they sold it to Ford. Then finally Ford put all these parts together and put it into a car, and then they sold the car. We would be counting really the same items 3, 4, or 5 times. So they say it can't be what they call an intermediate product. It can't be an intermediate good. It has to be a new final good, okay? Because the rationale is that when Ford sells that car or truck, it has all the prices of all those components in it when it finally sells the car, okay? Could be something as simple as a toaster. You know, you got the spring manufacturer, you got the thin sheet metal manufacturer, you got the plastic handles, you have the rubber cord, you've got all those different components. Well, if you counted all those components up, and certainly the process it took to make them, then you added it into the toaster, then you counted the toaster, well, you'd be counting all those items, you know, 3 and 4 times. So in order to avoid that, we say just final goods and services, okay? Now, of course, in some of the European countries, they probably wouldn't mind using that because it would kick up their gross domestic product, and they would have an easier time meeting their formulas for the EU in terms of deficit spending. But that's another topic. All right, so it would be final goods and services produced, okay? Now, that is the output definition of gross domestic product. The other one would be the expenditure, total expenditures, all right? And who spends money in our economy? Well, we've got total expenditures. You and I spend money. So consumer spending, that's number one, all right? And it just makes sense, all right? And what do we buy? Well, we buy typically durable and non-durable goods, all right? Now, non-durable goods would consist of things like food, something that's not going to last very long, okay? And non-durable goods normally are part of our spending no matter where we are in the business cycle. I mean, if times are getting, you know, improving, or if times are getting slower, we'll still buy, you know, food. There may be a change in the exact type, but we're still going to expend money on food, all right? Durable goods would be something like a refrigerator a washer, a dryer, right? Those are the ones that are better indicators of where we are in the business cycle. And a lot of researchers will keep track of that, durable goods. Because if we're on the upswing and times are getting better and better and business is expanding, well, you and I are probably going to be more likely to buy the washer or dryer, all right? Or buy that big flat screen TV, okay? So that's a better indicator where we are in the business cycle. However, if we're on the downswing of the business cycle, we're heading into in a recession, we might postpone the purchase of some non-durable goods, okay? And in addition to goods, we also spend money on services, all right? So that's the consumers, and we are the largest, okay? Second component of the economy would be investment spending. Typically thought of, business investment spending, so we call it I. Now, in that type of spending, we look at it and say, okay, that is spending to generate future sales. That's what we look at investment spending as. It's something that businesses will typically do. They'll buy something with the thought of it's to generate future sales, all right? So we include that. Now, inventories are also included in investment spending because if you were the owner of, let's say, a Ford dealer, there's one right down the street from the center campus, and you own that dealership and you looked out in the back lot and you saw all these Ford cars and trucks, well, it's inventory, but if you own the dealership, what you're thinking, you're looking at all those cars and trucks and you're looking at dollar signs, you're looking at future sales, you're looking at this is product that my sales force has to move, has to sell. So they count inventory as investment spending because they label it as future sales, all right? Then we have the government. Well, obviously the government does spend a fair amount of money on goods and services. And lastly, we have net exports, or what they call exports minus imports. And those would be anything exports we sell, ship overseas, and minus everything that we bring in, imports. Historically, in the last very long, last number of years, we have imported more than we have exported. But again, there's some schools of thought that think that is just god-awful. We always have to export more, export more, export more. It's not necessarily always true. It's not necessarily a bad thing if you're importing more than you're exporting. It all depends on the relationship to how large your economy is. Some economies that might be just on the verge of really expanding will need, let's say they'll need a lot of expensive machinery or components from overseas, and they'll bring them in, all right? Might end up then with imports as really a high number. Doesn't mean their economy is in trouble. It means they're on the verge of a major expansion, and they need all this very, very, very expensive equipment, from overseas. So we have to take that and think about it for a little bit. But we do add it as net. We call it net exports. Okay, so that would be all the spending. All right. So we got all the output, all the spending, total expenditures, and the last one is what we call total factor income. Well, the factors of production. Who are the factors of production? Well, you are, I am, we are the factors of production, all right? And what they say is, okay, sooner or later, no matter how you shake it out, the money will come into the households, all right? So what they do is they say, okay, we're going to take all possible factors, income that are coming into the household. So number one would be obviously wages would be the biggest one, all right, typically. And any interest, if you've earned interest, okay, again, not the bond. We don't count the bond itself, but if you have earned interest, the interest counts as part of income to your household, all right? Rent, if you rented out, for instance, a garage to a business to use for storage, that rent would also count, okay? And then any other interest or dividends from stocks, all right? We add all that together. So we bring it all into the households, because even dividends, you know, I say, well, how does that work? Well, even if a company, is making money, sooner or later, that money will flow into the households. So that's why we include that, all right? So that's total factor income. What's interesting is that no matter which method we choose, output, expenditure, or total factor income, they all give us the same number if we do it correctly, okay? So if, for instance, in the year 2020, our GDP was $21 trillion, well, no matter if we did 1, 2, or 3, 21 trillion, it would be the first method, second, and the third method, okay? So doesn't matter which method you use, you will always, if you did it correctly, arrive at the same figure, all right? And again, is this always 100% accurate? Well, no, because for instance, if you were, the weather's been changing, some days it's snowing, some days it's nice. If you were going to get your, let's say you were going to get your car washed, and you're heading to the car wash, and gee, the line is really long. So you thought, oh, forget it. I'm going to bring it home and I'm going to wash it myself. Or you bring it to one of those stations where you wash it yourself. Well, what have you done? Well, you affected GDP. You didn't let it grow by whatever the $15 it would have cost you to wash your car, just by that one decision, okay? Another example would be if you've got a good job, you got an A in economics, so you got a tremendous job and you're doing really well, and you've got a nice home, and you hire someone to clean your home, all right? You pay the cleaning service every week, okay? And then, gee whiz, after a couple of years, you fall in love with the person cleaning your home, and you get married. Well, in that case, you've actually made gross domestic product go down, because now you're not paying the cleaning service any longer because you've married this person, okay? So in that instance, GDP will go down. And a lot of other activities are not counted. In Europe, they are trying to count more and more what were considered illegal activities. Typically, if you're engaged in an illegal activity, you're not going to report it on your taxes, so that usually doesn't show up. But in Europe, trying to bring in what may have been considered an illegal activity in the past, it helps, it helps bolster up their gross domestic product. Now, this unreported figure from your textbook, it says it's about 10% roughly in our country. Typically, it's higher in other countries that are quite honestly are just poorer than ours, or poorer than the more developed countries. Trying to use the correct term for countries that are developing, but countries that haven't experienced the, shall we say, the growth or the economic benefits over the last 50 years that other countries have, they typically will have a lot less to be reported on in their gross domestic product and from your textbook it says it could go up to 30%. And I think that's probably accurate. And when you think about it, it just kind of makes sense that, yeah, we can see that a lot of those activities probably would not be recorded. Okay, so gross domestic product isn't perfect, but it's probably the best tool we have to gauge how the heck our economy is doing. Finally, we'll sign off with this one. Does money buy happiness? Well, money, as they say, money typically doesn't buy happiness. It does take the sharp edges off of life. That's true. Okay? And a higher gross domestic product generally is associated with a greater satisfaction of life. Okay? So I will go along with that. However, there have been some very, very wealthy people who have been absolutely miserable. There was one head of American Sunroof. The poor man, he was a billionaire, and he was a very, very unhappy individual, and ended up. And I had not that he wasn't my friend, but I knew who he was. I had occasion to have business lunches with him, and he ended up, taking his life, hanging himself. So, does money buy happiness? Well, yes and no, not really, but it does make, it takes the harsh edges off of life. So we'll go with that one. All right. Okay. So let's see. I think we've got this pretty well covered, and I think we've got time for another board. I'm trying to keep these videos on the shorter side because when they get really long, they take forever. For some reason, they take forever to load. All right, let's move on to the next one. This is just, again, going over some of the terms that we need to remember, all right? Which you definitely will need to remember, okay? Again, terms to remember, business cycle, okay? Well, it is, again, the short run fluctuations in economic activity, all right? And one cycle, peak to peak or trough to trough, typically is 6 to 8 years, okay? Again, economic expansion from the bottom of the trough going up to the peak, and we have increased business activity, but we can have a jobless recovery, okay? Especially with more of the service and the higher tech companies that are so prevalent, in our society today. You go back 100 years or more when we were looking at strictly manufacturing. Normally, rule of thumb, when a manufacturing company was growing and increased, typically that was always associated with increased employment. Because, they needed the bodies there to operate the machinery, all right? Not so much with the higher tech companies. Yes, they do employ, don't get me wrong, they do employ a lot of folks. But you can have a growing high-tech company that may or may not need all that many new faces as they grow. So in our society today, we can have what is called a jobless recovery, okay? Now, economic contraction, business is slowing down, and this is true, unlike the recovery, in every recession, every contraction, we have always experienced increased unemployment, all right? So we can have a jobless recovery, but every recession that we've had always is marked with higher unemployment, all right? So we should remember that one, all right? And we are a service economy, so let's get a good working term for what the heck a service is. Well, a service is output, okay, that it provides you and I a benefit. However, it provides this benefit without producing a tangible product, meaning something you can actually put your hand on, all right? For instance, a haircut, a shoe shine. You get your shoe shine, well, you know, is it a tangible product? I mean, you still have, it's the same shoes, they're shine, so there was a service done for you, but it's not a product you can put your hand on. So again, service is its output that provides a benefit without providing a tangible product. Could be something like a doctor's visit. And you could say, well, I'll argue that one because there's a product of my better health. Yes, but strictly speaking, you know, you walk out of you went to the doctor for your annual checkup, and you do feel better as you leave, but I mean, are you carrying anything out with you? Probably not. Of course, you go to the dentist, you'll probably be carrying out a new toothbrush, but that's beside the point. Okay, so a service is something, it is a benefit to us. However, we don't have a tangible product, all right? And the majority now of gross domestic product, it's important to have this working knowledge of a service because that's majority of gross domestic product is from the service area. Intermediate goods, those are all the things that we use in that chain that we were just talking about that goes into a final product, all right? Whether it's the bauxite, then the aluminum bars that are made into aluminum little transmission valves, all right? Those are all intermediate goods, okay? But eventually all of that is collected and is counted when the final good is sold, all right? So we have all these intermediate goods that we don't count because otherwise we'd be counting things 3 and 4 times, all right? Okay, so again, strictly speaking, intermediate goods that firms use either in their processing or repackaging with other goods to eventually make the final product, okay? Now, we talk about gross domestic product. When I was your age, we didn't really use gross domestic product. We talked about gross national product. What's the difference? Well, gross domestic product is centered on, and it's gotten more and more popular, and I think rightfully so, with the advent of, you know, globalization. You know, so much, I mean, we always had international trade, don't get me wrong, but now with the globalization of companies from different countries, other companies in other nations coming here, our companies, you know, locating plants overseas, in order to get a better handle on, hey, what's actually being produced in, you know, domestically, in our borders. The big push has been towards gross domestic product. So that is the stuff that is produced by workers and or resources within a nation's border, all right? So, excuse me, years ago, when we were talking about gross national product, what we were concentrating on were the companies, our domestic companies. And it didn't matter if GM or Ford or Chrysler had, you know, 20 plants overseas, all that stuff counted as long as it was an American company, counted under gross national product. And conversely, if there were other foreign companies that had manufacturing plants here, even though it was made in this country, we did not count that because we considered it, you know, a foreign company, so we didn't count those items. Now we talk about gross domestic product. Not so much concerned about, is it the company located here or is it located over in Germany? It's where is the stuff? Where are the things being made? All right? And, excuse me, and that makes sense because, well, when I was in your age, they didn't have all these BMW plants over here, or Volkswagen plants over here, Toyota plants over here. So we have a big influx of foreign companies making goods and services here. So those should count. So that's why we have gone more to gross domestic product, okay, rather than gross national product, which means just the U.S. companies, and doesn't matter where it's made, all that counts. Well, no, it doesn't count. It only counts if it's domestically made. Remember, it's a final good or service, all right, new and domestically made, all right? And that gives us a pretty good handle on what's going on in our country. How are we really doing, all right? And I think that's a good thing that they switched to that, all right? Okay. The last one is net domestic product. Now, and we'll be talking about this a little bit more when you start talking about growth theory. Net domestic product is in the operation, of our economy. All right, machinery, assets start losing their value every year. We'll produce so much stuff, final goods and services. However, we have to remember that in the course of that year, let's face it, some equipment is used up. Some becomes obsolete just because of age. So we have to take that out. We have to replace it. Or some that we've been running the machinery like mad for, let's say 24/7, making different parts. It has lost its value because now it has been running constantly. So depreciation is a big factor. We will talk about this quite a bit more when we talk about growth theory. But depreciation, it's the loss of value. And again, it really just kind of makes common sense. It's the loss of value of our assets through time and or use, okay? So when we take that figure out, say, okay, we've used up this much or this, so we got this number of machining centers that are just all used up. These didn't run all the time, but now they're so old, we're taking those out. So we take the depreciation factor out of gross domestic product, and it gives us a term called net domestic product, okay? And I think that's valid to say, okay, let's take out all the things that we've used, the machinery that we've used so much that it's now pretty well shot, or that is so old that it gave up the ghost this year, so we're taking that out too. So that gives us the term net domestic product. Okay? All right. Well, I'm going to stop this video and I'm going to click on, we'll have a second one on unemployment in just 1 minute.